I think that we're going to tag team here, where I'm going to start. It's a huge honor to be here at the Danielou Seminar. Again, it's doubly huge to be with the boss. Dominique and I have been slowly co-authoring this argument. It's a paper with an argument, but it's a little bit sprawling, so I hope you'll bear with us. Luckily, it's easily conceptualized in a 2x2. Political scientists love 2x2s. This is even better because it's not ours. It is from a gentleman named Stathis Kalivas, who wrote a very useful book called The Logic of Violence and Civil War, which is an effort to synthesize a great deal of literature of the sort that was discussed in the first panel this morning on the kinds of violence that you see in irregular warfare, and in particular the treatment of civilians. The dependent variable, the outcome variable that Stathis is interested in, is how civilians are treated in civil wars, and he talks about shifting zones of control between incumbents and insurgents in civil war. And importantly, in order to make his argument, it is important that he define the technology of warfare in a way that sets scope conditions for the kinds of cases that he's talking about. So this 2x2 is a simple way of conceptualizing that. So if you have functionally parity between the actors, so both the rebels and the incumbents are fighting on more or less equal terms with essentially the same technology, we would call that a conventional civil war. So if the state is high capacity. So when we think about conventional civil wars, what we're thinking about is, say, the American Civil War, where you've got essentially two different armies that look the same, they're armed the same, and they fight on large battlefields. If you talk to Americans and you tell them that you study civil wars, they just start talking about Gettysburg. They think the American Civil War is the only civil war. And that's misleading because it's actually nothing like most civil wars. The modal civil war, the average civil war, 80% of the density, kernel density in the data, is this lower left-hand corner, irregular warfare. This at least used to be true. There's some arguments about whether or not this is still the case since the end of the Cold War. But certainly when Stathis's book went to press, he made the strong case that irregular warfare is much, much, much more common. What you usually have is a strong state and then a rebel group that can't really compete head-to-head. At the very, very end of guerrilla war, what Mao would call stage 3, you have to beat the army. But most of the war is fought in Mao's stage 1 or stage 2, where the rebels are setting off bombs, the rebels are on the run, maybe they control the town at night, but someone else controls it during the day. And those kinds of dynamics are well studied, and they're actually well understood, and that's the literature review that Stathis uses to organize his book. It's also the literature base and the theoretical base that most political scientists have used as we have tried to do political science in the name of public policy, helping the missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's like the workhorse models that political scientists who have been working on civil wars, all of us are assuming that we're working in an irregular warfare environment because, that's what the blue team has been doing for the last 15 years. Importantly, there's a third cell, which is Stathis noting that sometimes you have parity between the actors, but the state is just incredibly weak. And in these cases, it's hard to really make predictions at all. And we would conventionally call these failed states. So think Somalia, think Liberia. These are places where it is a mistake to think that there is actually a center that is doing counterinsurgency at all. And even if there's parity between the actors, it's because the state is really not that much more than a decentralized band of militias itself. So you have militia on militia violence, but it's hard to make theoretical predictions because it's all just so complicated. I spent a lot of time living and working in Tajikistan, and that's how I think about Tajikistan's civil war. Okay, conventional wars are quite rare as an empirical fact. Since 1945, when Stathis wrote his original article, he could count like 3 or 4 of them. The Biafran Civil War, when the Nigerian military split. The Spanish Civil War is a classic case. Some of the latter parts of the Vietnam War, the American Civil War. You're hard-pressed to actually put together a longer list than that when you start thinking through the cases. Now, since the end of the Cold War, there are some people who have argued that more wars have this characteristic. I'll take issue with that if you guys wish. But suffice to say, for this point in the program, conventional wars are pretty rare. But the argument that we're going to make is that a conventional war is exactly what we have in Ukraine. So at this point, I think I'm going to turn it over to Dominique, and we'll talk about how we got there.
Thank you, Jesse. Of course, the minute we start talking about civil war, then it's the radioactive term, a bit like genocide is with Holodomor studies, and it gets emotional, and it's immediately being decoded as well, it's essentially the Russian position, that is something internal to Ukraine. It kind of denies or minimizes Russian intervention, etc. Well, it's obviously not what we're arguing, but we're arguing that it is actually in the family of wars, a civil war, but a very unusual type, as Jesse just intimated. But because there's a civil or internal component to it, let's go to the roots. Let's go back to February 2014. And the story is one, actually, of distinguishing state and regime. We had this, I initiated that discussion in the previous panel. Because we have regime fall or regime collapse, we have state incapacitation and state kind of resurgence. So the distinction between state and regime and state, what do I mean by that? First, we have the violence, the lethal violence. That, we're talking 18th and 20th of February, led to, for the first time in, 4 years of the regime of Yanukovych, that you had significant defections from party members. It never happened before. You had one defection in November 23rd, at the very beginning of Euromaidan, when you had police brutality, like non-lethal violence that was shockingly enough. One defection, the regime, or more specifically the parliamentarians here in Parliament, the region's deputies, just held fast. Same in January when the dictatorship laws, so-called dictatorship laws were passed, again, it was a monolith. It cracks for the first time precisely because of the violence. It cracks in a very interesting way, is that suddenly Yanukovych in one evening, that's the evening that he will spend the night now negotiating with the EU foreign ministers, he's losing his deputies from central Ukraine. He never really had deputies from western Ukraine to begin with, a couple, kind of token. They're also gone, and he's losing that deputation. So you could say his patron-client relations. Interestingly, by the evening, we've got suddenly the east-west kind of divide. Now, that parliament basically passes a critical resolution saying the violence is entirely the responsibility of the regime. The police has to withdraw. And as a result, the police withdrew, because negotiations for the withdrawal of the police began even before Yanukovych was finished negotiating the all-night session with the EU. So you have police defection that during the fateful day of 21st of February expand to the point that basically, as we say in French, le roi est nu. Suddenly he's totally defenseless. By the time he turns around, he signs the agreement at 4 in the afternoon, but there's nobody around, not even to protect the presidential administration, and he flees within hours. That leads to regime vacuum, to regime collapse. Overnight, suddenly, all the top leaders and the presidents are gone from the Party of Regions. But on Saturday, we have reassertion of state power. The regime collapsed, but not the state. Parliament convenes. We have the impeachment vote, where basically, well, by Friday, Yanukovych has already lost now the deputies from southern Ukraine. By Saturday, he's lost most of the region's deputies except Donetsk. The Donetsk deputies that actually don't vote for impeachment, but by Sunday, they renege, we're talking mid-level by that point, mid-level region's deputies, they renege on Yanukovych, they denounce him, and they essentially support the regime change. Now, that's in Kiev. Regime collapse, state reassertion. Then we've got rapidly Crimea, when it's essentially Russian occupation. So Russian captures the state, because they literally captures parliament and all the major state institutions, including the police and the army. So you got massive defections. Apparently half of the Ukrainian army stationed in Crimea defects to what now becomes the Russian army, and again on the police side. And we know what happened. It's in Crimea, it's done. But then we move to Donbas, And here the collapse of the regime at the center, and that regime was almost exclusively from Donbas, all the top positions. That collapse meant, actually, I wouldn't call it a state collapse, but a state incapacitation. That in Donbas, contrary to Kiev or to Crimea, suddenly there is no more command for security forces for a period of 4 to 6 weeks before you actually have the penetration of Russian military personnel and the special forces and so forth. You have a situation where maybe the administrative states continue to function, but there's no more law and order in Donbas. The state, or the state 101 law and order, as if not collapsed, has become incapacitated. That is actually, these are the conditions that allowed for Russian penetration. No resistance. You come in. That doesn't explain the war, obviously, that becomes then conventional and so forth. And it becomes indeed a conventional war that's only possible if you have access to armaments from major states. But the genesis is something that happened internally in Ukraine, that in this critical territory of Donbas, in a sense, there's no more state for a longer period that allows, and crucially, those combatants or rebels, the early, again, opponents, they'll storm the regional office of or oblast or city government building, but they don't actually capture the police, the army, or parliament. Contrary to Crimea, everything goes parallel to the state structures that are actually being hollowed out. The evidence that we have is that there's actually relatively few police defections in Donbas. There's a celebrated case of this Khodakovsky, SBU, etc. Has got his battalions, but on the whole, we don't have the story of Crimea. These are the conditions that can explain then, again, or made possible the conventional civil war.
The conventional civil war is really a term of art about the kind of fighting that has taken place, and I'm going to just speak in broad brushstrokes, and then we can kick it out to questions for more details. But the long and short of it is that what you have had is not nearly as bad as what was described this morning in the conversation, where the kind of tactics that are very, very common, horrifyingly common, if you think about insurgency in general. None of that has happened. Hardly any of that has happened. You can find individual cases, but partially because of the proliferation of cheap cell phones around the planet, and partially because we have a lot of journalists in the area, I think we'd know. I think if there had been mass rapes, I think we would know about it, don't you? Right? So there have been parts of the planet where you have had more IEDs go off in a single week than have gone off in all of the Ukraine war. There have been a couple of them. They're homemade devices, but it's nothing like I thought it was going to be a year ago. And that's really the main point that I want to leave this with. I remember being at this seminar a year ago and having some conversations with Keith Darden, some conversations with some other people about what this was going to look like in a year or in 2 years. And I have to say, it is horrible. Every single death is a tragedy, but the death count is a lot lower than I thought it would be, because I thought that Ukraine was moving in the direction of either state failure or irregular war, depending on what Russia's response to the violence that was going to happen was going to be. Then that violence never happened and there was no response. What we have had instead is the conventionalization of the war, what looked like warlordism, and I coded it. I got the names, and I have the names of every single Ukrainian battalion commander. All of them, it's all public. They're all on Facebook. I've called them up. I know how many men they claim to have working for them. I have all these data. I'm not worried about human subjects concerns because they're all public figures. There's no war on terror aspect. I'm not putting together a predator drone list here. This is just all completely public. And at first it looked like warlordism, and now it actually looks like a sort of Twitter-enabled levy en masse. These guys have all joined the state. They have functionally subordinated their chains of command to the institutions of the Ministry of Defense and Ministry of the Interior. There are exceptions. I'm not going to claim that this is a professional military. Azov is not like special forces. No. But like compared to what I thought it was going to be, and I'm a student of the Georgian Civil War and a student of the Tajik Civil War. I carry a very dark, nuanced model in my head of what state failure looks like, and we haven't seen it yet. And that's really positive news for the Ukrainian nationalists in the room. It's also really positive room generically from a human rights perspective, that there has been a positive role that has been played by the OSCE and by other humanitarian groups in terms of keeping the line. There have been a lot of decentralized efforts by populations to just get out of the way. What you can't have in an irregular war, what you can't have when it is, as was described, I think, really eloquently this morning, 3 different state-building projects happening on the same territory. The civilians can't get away because the civilians are the resource that everyone's trying to tax, and so you hold them there. When it's a conventional war, by contrast, you draw a line, there's a no man's land, and you figure out what side of the line you want to be on. There have been decentralized efforts, some of which have been covered, to set up taxi services to get families across the line. It's starting to look quite stable. The technology of murder is not handguns and knives. The technology of murder is artillery. So you have this sort of a theatrical World War II style battle that will break out every couple of months. But again, you can get out of the way, and a surprising number of people have just kind of gone home after, and they understand that this is the new normal. But it's not civilian targeting in quite the same way that we saw in Chechnya with the same kinds of weapons. It's just not like that. That has not happened. So I want to say 2 more things quickly before we hand it over to the audience. If that's, are we all right on time?
I wanted my 2 minutes more.
All right. So you do your 2 minutes, and then I'll do my 2. My last 2 minutes. I want to talk about the disadvantages of calling it a civil war as an academic, because I think there are some. So I'll end with that. If you want to jump in.
It's just reinforcing the point. I know we're 2 minutes within our 20 minutes here, okay? This is not to minimize civilian
Heavens
suffering.
no.
Because obviously we had evidence at this seminar. Anders told us, economic production goes down like to 30%. We know it's over 1 million, is it 1.5 million of refugees? It's social and economic devastation. The figures are not small it depends on the comparison, but of course if the comparison is intra-Ukrainian, the first 3 deaths in January 2014 were shocking because nobody had ever been murdered for political reasons in Ukraine. And then we moved to 100 in February on Maidan, and then the latest count is 8,000. Civilians are probably in the 6,000 range. There's probably more than 8,000 because we don't have the death count of the combatants. But at least half of the deaths of civilians, and we're talking again 5,000 to 6,000. It's enormous. But at the same time, in the family of civil war, since the vast majority of contemporary civil wars are irregular warfare, it's relatively small. It's relatively small partly because of the technology of warfare. The thing is, Ukraine calls it an anti-terrorist operation. The point is actually that it's precisely not terrorism. If it was a terrorist or it's a counter-operation to terrorism, if it was terrorism, then you would see the civilian casualties going way up because you would have basically people being bombed, or you would get death squads targeting civilians, so you would get ethnic cleansing of the type that we saw even in the former Soviet Union, the cases that Jesse studied. So that there is something, again, in all this social devastation, something unique in actually containing, we know from world experience, the civilian fatalities. Because, of course, suffering, there's many levels of suffering, and 1/3 of the population is actually leaving the area. It means it's pretty grave. But we're not talking 50 to 100,000 people. And that's what we're trying to link here, the technology of warfare with the civilian count, while still putting again, the fight or the war in a family of civil wars. Only 1 minute.
All right.
Extra 30 seconds.
Okay, so in 90 seconds, I think there are a couple of disadvantages to using the term civil war, even though it's an academic term of art, as Dominique said. The first is that it's obscurantist, that by not calling it an invasion, you're somehow playing into Russian propaganda. I don't take that one very seriously, but I do take the next two pretty seriously. The second is that there is that community of social scientists, of which I call myself a part, who have been studying the dynamics of irregular warfare for a long time. And we're at a point where we actually have findings and syllabi and experimental tests of our theories. And I worry what will happen when that community starts playing around with a set of models that are calibrated for one kind of warfare in an environment where they don't fit, or where they start saying things that are functionally wrong, but that are bad science, but they think they're right. And the social scientists, political scientists in general, we are in love with our theories, and we now have 15 years or so of real serious theory building that has happened in the Civil War space, all of which, if you take Stothas's theory conceptualization framework, is misplaced, is misspecified. It is not actually, we have built a knowledge base that does not work real well for what we're trying to describe. The people who potentially have been working on those kinds of models are people who work in international relations and in IR, people who take Thomas Schelling really seriously, people who think about deterrence and interstate warfare. But again, that's just a different part of the ivory tower. That is a different part of the academy. And I don't welcome those people getting into Civil War studies for separate reasons. The third disadvantage of calling it a civil war can be quickly summarized, which is that I worry about conflating the Donbas and Crimea episodes. I think that Donbas is dripping with every kind of ambiguity, but is not actually a crass violation of international law in quite the same way that the Crimea territory is. And the Crimea territorial seizure is really a very big problem in terms of the post-1945 order that that does not actually have an analogy to Donbas. And this is a problem from the humanitarian perspective, because the Donbas is where all of the people are dying. It's where the humanitarian machinery that the UN has built is at work. But Crimea is where the big rules of the game got broken. And conflating those two is a problem. And I'm not really sure how to fix it. And I'm worried that the use of the word civil war contributes to it. So those are the disadvantages.